people who have near-death experiences, when I tell them I want to do scientific research into what happened to them, they kind of look at me like I'm out of my mind. Why would you bother to do that? You know, it's perfectly obvious to them they had a legitimate experience. What does science add to that? But the fact is that, as you mentioned, we are living in a scientific world right now and have been for the past few centuries. And science is the way that we validate for ourselves whether our experiences are real or not. Now, I think we have to differentiate between science and materialism. A lot of people don't get the distinction. Science is a rigorous way of observing things and drawing conclusions from your observations through logical deduction. Many of the advances we've made in science in the past few centuries have been with the physical world. And because of that, science has become tied up with materialism, the philosophy that everything that exists is physical and that things that aren't physical aren't really real. Well, that's a nice philosophy, but it's got nothing to do with science. Obviously, scientists study a whole lot of things that aren't physical. For example, emotions. We study love, anger. Those aren't physical things. There are physical events in the body that go along with those, but they're not, the emotion itself is not physical. And a lot of the experiences that we're talking about here, not only near-death experiences, but other spiritual or religious experiences, are not basically materialistic. They're not based on the physical world. But that doesn't mean that science cannot address them. You know, science looks at a lot of things that aren't material, aren't physical, and yet we can draw conclusions about them by looking at their after effects, by how they affect us. For example, talking about love. You can't study love physically, but you can look at how being in love affects someone's behavior, speech, emotions, and so forth. And by studying those after effects or those concomitants of the emotion, you can learn about the emotion itself. This is not so different from studying physical things. We study physical particles that are too small to see directly and too short-lived to really measure. But we shoot these particles through a bubble chamber, a pool of, say, liquid nitrogen, and it leaves a trail of bubbles. And by looking at the bubbles, you can tell a lot about the particle, even though you can't measure the particle itself. The same way when you're studying non-material things like emotions or near-death experiences, you can't measure the experience itself, but you can measure how it affects people, the trail of bubbles it leaves in someone's life.